Marcus stared at the termination letter. Third job in 18 months. The words blurred: performance issues, attitude problems, inability to handle pressure. His hands shook like autumn leaves. The coffee shop hummed around him. Laptops clicking. Steam hissing. Normal people living normal lives while his world cracked apart again. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe." But breathing felt like drowning in reverse. The letter sat there, mocking him. A piece of paper with the power to unravel everything he'd built since the divorce, since Sarah took the kids, since his father's funeral when he'd stood at the graveside promising to be better, stronger, someone who mattered. 3 jobs. 3 failures. His phone buzzed. Sarah's lawyer. Probably about missed child support. Again. Marcus folded the letter with surgical precision. Creased each edge until it formed a perfect square. Then, he did something he'd never done before in 34 years of catastrophic living. He laughed. Not the bitter laugh of a broken man. Not the hollow echo of defeat. Something else. Something that started in his chest and spread outward like warm honey through his veins. The laugh belonged to someone else. Someone who found cosmic humor in the systematic destruction of everything weak and worthless about Marcus Reeves. Finally, he said to no one. Finally. The transformation began with a simple recognition: every external force that had shattered him was merely exposing cracks that already existed. His boss hadn't destroyed his confidence, he'd never possessed any. Sarah hadn't abandoned a strong man, she'd left a weak one who happened to pay rent in her vicinity. The divorce. The job losses. The mounting debt. The sleepless nights staring at a ceiling that seemed to press closer each morning. None of it was happening to him. It was happening because of him. Because somewhere in the architecture of his being lived a trembling, desperate creature that handed control of his peace to anyone willing to take it. A creature that measured its worth by external validation and crumbled when that validation was withdrawn. That creature had to die. Not metaphorically. Not gradually. It had to be torn out by the roots and burned until nothing remained but ash and possibility. The first rule of psychological warfare is understanding the battlefield. Marcus spread his failures across his kitchen table like a general studying maps. Bank statements. Performance reviews. Text messages from Sarah that started with "we need to talk" and ended with his heart in fragments. Each document told the same story: a man who gave his power away piece by piece until he had nothing left to surrender. Power, he said aloud, tasting the word. When did I decide I didn't deserve any? The answer came like a slap. He'd never decided. He'd simply accepted the world's assessment of his worth and internalized it so completely that he became an active participant in his own destruction. His father's voice echoed from 20 years past: "You're too sensitive, boy. World's gonna eat you alive if you don't toughen up." The old Marcus would have felt shame at that memory. Shame at disappointing a dead man. Shame at proving him right. The new Marcus, the one being forged in this moment, felt something else entirely. Gratitude. Because his father had given him a map to his own weakness. A blueprint for reconstruction. Sensitivity wasn't the problem. Sensitivity was data. The problem was letting that data destabilize him instead of inform him. When his boss had called him unreliable, the old Marcus heard, "You are worthless." The new Marcus heard, "This person is trying to transfer their anxiety onto you." When Sarah had said, "You never listen to me," the old Marcus heard, "You are fundamentally flawed." The new Marcus heard, "This person is frustrated and using hyperbole to express it." The shift was subtle but revolutionary. Instead of absorbing external judgments as objective truth, he began treating them as data points to be analyzed, understood, and filed away without emotional investment. Someone's opinion of him became no more significant than their opinion of the weather, interesting information that had no bearing on his core stability. The process wasn't comfortable. Destroying the weak self felt like performing surgery on a conscious patient. Every day brought new opportunities to revert to old patterns, to hand his emotional state to whoever demanded it. A rude cashier. A honking driver. A condescending email from his landlord. Each interaction became a test. Would he react from the place of weakness that sought approval and feared confrontation? Or would he respond from the growing core of strength that remained unshakable regardless of external circumstances? The cashier was having a bad day. Marcus smiled and thanked her anyway. Not to be nice. Not to model better behavior. Because his internal state was his responsibility, and hers was irrelevant to his peace. The driver was late and stressed. Marcus maintained his speed and let them pass. Not from fear. From the understanding that their emergency wasn't his problem to solve or internalize. The landlord was frustrated about late rent. Marcus acknowledged the situation and proposed a solution. Not from desperation. From the calm recognition that problems required solutions, not emotional investment. Each response carved away another piece of the reactive, approval-seeking creature that had masqueraded as his identity for 3 decades. The turning point came during a job interview. 6th one in 2 months. Marcus sat across from a hiring manager who wielded his clipboard like a weapon and asked questions designed to expose weakness. Why should we hire someone with your employment history? The old Marcus would have stammered. Apologized. Made excuses. Handed over his dignity in exchange for the possibility of acceptance. The new Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled. Because I've spent the last 6 months systematically identifying and eliminating every weakness that made me unemployable. The man sitting across from you doesn't exist in those previous jobs. He's been destroyed and replaced with someone who sees problems as projects and setbacks as data. The interviewer's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. That's an interesting perspective. It's the only perspective that matters. You can hire someone who's never been tested and hope they perform under pressure. Or you can hire someone who's been forged in failure and emerged stronger. Your choice. Marcus got the job. Not because of his qualifications. Not because of his charm. Because he'd become the kind of person who couldn't be shaken by someone else's attempt to destabilize him. The weak self that had crumbled under criticism was gone. In its place sat someone who viewed challenges as entertainment and setbacks as information. Someone unshakable. Part 2, The Physics of Invulnerability. Elena learned about power the way most people learn about gravity, by falling. The boardroom stretched like an aircraft hangar. 30-foot ceilings. Windows that looked out over a city she'd spent 7 years learning to navigate. Mahogany table polished to mirror brightness, reflecting the faces of 12 men who decided her fate before she'd entered the room. We're restructuring, said Harrison, the CFO with dead shark eyes and a handshake that felt like shaking hands with a fish. Your position is being eliminated. 7 years. 60-hour weeks. Missed birthdays. Cancelled vacations. Relationships that withered from neglect while she built someone else's empire. Eliminated, she repeated. The word tasted like copper pennies. We'll provide references, of course. Excellent references. Your work has been adequate. Adequate. The weak Elena, the one who'd spent 7 years seeking their approval, wanted to cry. Wanted to ask what she'd done wrong. Wanted to beg for another chance, a different role, anything to avoid starting over. That Elena had to die in this moment. Right here. Right now. While 12 men watched and waited for her to break. Elena stood. Smoothed her skirt. Smiled with the kind of calm that comes from watching your old self burn to the ground and feeling grateful for the warmth. Gentlemen, she said, thank you for the gift. Harrison's forehead wrinkled. Gift? You've just freed me from the delusion that my worth was tied to your opinion of it. That's invaluable. She turned toward the door, paused, looked back. Oh, and, Harrison? When your wife calls looking for the yacht maintenance receipts, they're in the locked drawer of your desk. Along with the other receipts she might find interesting. She left them sitting in stunned silence. 3 months later, she'd launched her own consulting firm. 6 months after that, she was billing her former company 4 times her old salary to solve problems they couldn't handle without her. The transformation hadn't been mystical. It had been mechanical. Like learning to perform surgery on your own nervous system. The science of unshakability begins with understanding the difference between responding and reacting. Reactions are involuntary. They emerge from the limbic brain, the ancient system designed to keep mammals alive in environments where threats were physical and immediate. A charging lion. A falling tree. A territorial rival. In the modern world, that same system treats professional criticism like physical danger and social rejection like death. It floods the body with stress hormones, narrows perception to tunnel vision, and hijacks rational thinking in favor of fight or flight responses that solve nothing and create everything to regret. Responses, by contrast, are chosen. They emerge from the prefrontal cortex, the newer system capable of abstract thinking, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. They process information without attachment, consider consequences before acting, and maintain physiological calm regardless of external stimuli. The difference between someone who can be shaken and someone who cannot is simply this: the unshakable person has trained themselves to respond instead of react. Every single time. Elena's training began with a simple exercise, the pause. Between stimulus and response, Viktor Frankl had written, lies our freedom to choose. Elena decided to make that space as wide as possible. When someone criticized her work, she paused. Counted to 3. Breathed deeply. Asked herself, is this person trying to help me improve, or trying to make themselves feel better by diminishing me? The answer informed her response. When a client demanded unreasonable deadlines, she paused. Considered the request objectively. Asked herself, what would serve the project best, and what would serve my long-term reputation best? The answer shaped her counter-proposal. When her mother called with the monthly guilt session about missing family dinners, she paused. Recognized the pattern. Asked herself, is this about genuine connection, or about control disguised as concern? The answer determined her boundaries. Each pause carved out space between who she'd been reactive, approval-seeking, perpetually destabilized, and who she was becoming, someone whose internal state remained constant regardless of external chaos. The hardest part wasn't learning to pause. The hardest part was accepting what the pause revealed. Most of the people in Elena's life had been unconsciously invested in her remaining shakeable. Her reactivity made them feel powerful. Her need for approval made them feel valuable. Her emotional instability made them feel stable by comparison. When she stopped providing those services, relationships shifted. Some people adapted. They learned to interact with the new Elena, the one who listened without absorbing, who cared without carrying, who helped without sacrificing her own stability. Others couldn't adjust. They escalated their attempts to destabilize her. Pushed harder for reactions. Demanded explanations for her calmness. Accused her of being cold, calculating, inhuman. Elena learned to see these accusations as compliments in disguise. Cold meant they couldn't make her react. Calculating meant she thought before responding. Inhuman meant she'd transcended the primitive programming that kept them trapped in emotional chaos. The breakthrough came during a crisis that would have destroyed the old Elena. Her biggest client, 60% of her revenue, called on a Friday afternoon to cancel their contract. No warning. No explanation beyond strategic realignment. Just the sound of a year's worth of security evaporating through the phone. The old Elena would have panicked. Called everyone she knew. Stayed up all night crafting desperate emails. Made decisions from a place of fear that would have taken months to undo. The new Elena hung up the phone and felt nothing. Not numbness. Not denial. Just the calm recognition that this was information, not catastrophe. She opened a spreadsheet. Calculated her runway. Reviewed her pipeline. Identified 3 potential clients who might accelerate their timelines. drafted a simple email announcing her increased availability. By Monday morning, she had 2 new contracts and 1 proposal request. The client who'd cancelled called the following week. Their strategic realignment had lasted exactly 10 days before they realized they'd fired their most competent vendor. Could she possibly consider taking them back? Elena quoted them triple her previous rate. They accepted. Because the person who cannot be shaken is also the person who cannot be replaced. Unshakability isn't about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming emotionally sovereign. Elena still felt frustration, disappointment, anger, joy. The difference was that she felt them without being ruled by them. Emotions became data instead of directives. Information instead of instructions. When a project went badly, she felt disappointed. She also asked, "What can this teach me?" When a client was unreasonable, she felt annoyed. She also asked, "Is this worth my energy?" When a competitor tried to poach her team, she felt angry. She also asked, "How can I better secure loyalty?" Each emotion provided information. None of them provided instructions. She was the one who decided what to do with what she felt. The most profound change wasn't in how others treated her. It was in how she treated herself. The old Elena had been her own harshest critic. Every mistake became evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Every setback proved she didn't deserve success. Every criticism confirmed her worst fears about her own incompetence. The new Elena had become her own most reliable ally. Mistakes became learning opportunities. Setbacks became course corrections. Criticism became market research. She'd stopped seeking external validation because she'd learned to provide internal validation. She'd stopped fearing external judgment because she'd learned to trust internal wisdom. The weak self that had needed others to feel worthy was gone. In its place lived someone who knew her own value and required no confirmation from a world too busy with its own problems to accurately assess hers. Someone who could not be shaken because she was not built on a foundation that others controlled. Someone who had learned the ultimate secret: the only opinion of you that matters is the one you hold of yourself. And, when that opinion is unshakably positive, nothing external can touch your core. Part 3, The Philosophy of Permanent Strength. The philosopher understood suffering better than most. Not because he'd experienced more pain than others, but because he'd learned to observe it with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. Pain was data. Suffering was optional interpretation. He sat in his study at 3 a.m, reading Seneca by candlelight while the world slept around him. The letter had arrived that afternoon, the one he'd been expecting for months. The university position. The one that would have solved everything. The financial pressure. The professional validation. The proof that 20 years of dedicated study hadn't been wasted. We regret to inform you. The weak self would have been destroyed. The weak self had been planning a life around that position. The weak self had told friends, family, strangers at coffee shops about the opportunity. Had imagined the office with windows. The respectful students. The chance to finally matter in a world that seemed to reward everything except thoughtful contemplation of existence. The weak self was humiliated. Embarrassed. Devastated. The strong self was curious. Because rejection, like all external events, was simply another opportunity to examine the machinery of attachment and suffering. Another chance to practice what every great philosopher had discovered, that peace comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting nothing you cannot control. Machiavelli had written about power in political terms. How to acquire it, maintain it, deploy it against enemies and rivals. But he'd missed the deeper truth that the Stoics understood: the only power worth possessing is power over your own mind. External power can be taken. Positions eliminated. Wealth redistributed. Relationships ended. Reputation destroyed. Internal power, the calm center that remains untouchable regardless of external circumstances, can only be surrendered. And surrender was always a choice. The philosopher had spent 2 decades studying this choice. Not just intellectually, but practically. Using his own life as a laboratory for testing ancient wisdom against modern challenges. Every disappointment became a case study in non-attachment. Every success became an exercise in maintaining equanimity during good fortune. Every relationship became practice in loving without clinging, caring without controlling. The university rejection was simply the latest experiment. The process began with a simple question: what exactly am I suffering about? Not the rejection itself. The rejection was neutral information. A committee had made a decision based on criteria he couldn't control. The suffering came from the story he told himself about what the rejection meant. The narrative that connected external events to internal worth. The belief system that required outside validation to maintain inner stability. Those stories had to be examined. Questioned. Systematically dismantled. Story 1: I'm not good enough. Reality check: good enough for what? According to whom? Based on what criteria? The committee had made a decision based on institutional needs, political considerations, budget constraints, and personality factors that had nothing to do with his qualifications or character. Their decision was about them, not him. Story 2: I've wasted 20 years. Reality check: wasted how? He'd spent 2 decades learning to think clearly, write elegantly, and understand the deepest questions humans had ever asked. Every moment of that education enriched his ability to engage with existence itself. The university position would have been nice. It wasn't necessary. Story 3: people will think I'm a failure. Reality check: people think thousands of thoughts every day. Most of them are about themselves. Their opinion of his career trajectory was neither their business nor his responsibility. Besides, anyone who measured human worth by institutional affiliations was revealing their own limitations, not his. Each story dissolved under examination. Each narrative that connected external events to internal worth proved to be optional interpretation rather than objective reality. The transformation from shakeable to unshakable required understanding 3 fundamental truths that most people never learn. First, you are not your circumstances. Circumstances are temporary conditions that change constantly based on factors beyond your control. You are the conscious awareness that observes circumstances without being defined by them. When your job ends, you are not unemployed. You are someone currently between positions. When a relationship fails, you are not unlovable. You are someone learning about compatibility. When health problems arise, you are not sick. You are someone dealing with a physical challenge. The distinction isn't semantic. It's ontological. It separates your essential self from the temporary experiences that flow through your life like weather through landscape. Second, you are not your thoughts. Thoughts are mental events that arise and pass away like clouds in an empty sky. You are the sky, the conscious space in which thoughts appear, exist for a while, and disappear. When anxiety arises, you are not anxious. You are someone observing anxiety. When anger appears, you are not angry. You are someone watching anger. When sadness emerges, you are not sad. You are someone witnessing sadness. This distance between the observer and the observed creates space for choice. You can examine thoughts without believing them, feel emotions without being controlled by them, experience impulses without acting on them. Third, you are not your story. The narrative you tell about your life, who you are, what you've accomplished, what you deserve, what others think of you, is a construction, not a fact. It's a useful fiction that helps organize experience, but it's not reality itself. When you identify with the story, you become vulnerable to anything that threatens its continuity. Bad news becomes personal attack. Criticism becomes existential crisis. Change becomes catastrophe. When you hold the story lightly, recognizing it as one possible interpretation among many, you maintain perspective regardless of external events. The philosopher tested these insights against progressively difficult challenges. Small tests first: rude cashiers, traffic delays, minor disappointments. Could he maintain equanimity when life failed to meet his preferences? Medium tests, professional setbacks, relationship conflicts, health concerns. Could he remain stable when circumstances became genuinely challenging? Large tests, major losses, serious illnesses, fundamental life changes. Could he preserve inner peace when everything external fell apart? The university rejection had been a large test. Not because the position mattered so much, but because he'd allowed himself to imagine a future that depended on external validation. He'd passed the test by recognizing it as a test. By remembering that his worth wasn't determined by committee decisions. By maintaining curiosity about the experience rather than collapsing into victimhood. The strongest form of power is not needing power. The person who requires external validation is always vulnerable to those who control the validation. The person who needs others to behave certain ways is always frustrated by others' autonomy. The person who measures success by external metrics is always destabilized by external changes. But the person who has learned to validate themselves, who expects nothing from others except what they freely offer, who measures success by internal criteria, that person cannot be touched by external forces. They become like water that flows around obstacles without resistance. Like mountains that remain stable regardless of weather. Like space itself, which contains all phenomena without being disturbed by any of them. This isn't numbness or disconnection. It's the deepest form of engagement possible, involvement without attachment, care without clinging, love without possessiveness. The philosopher's phone rang at dawn. His sister, calling from across the country with news about their father. The cancer had spread. 6 months, maybe less. The old self would have been devastated. Would have felt guilty about the distance, angry about the timing, overwhelmed by the complexity of mortality and family and unfinished conversations. The new self felt all of those things and remained centered in the middle of them. Grief was natural. Fear was understandable. Regret was human. None of them required him to lose his balance. He listened to his sister's tears without absorbing them as his own. He felt his own sadness without drowning in it. He made practical plans while holding space for impractical emotions. This was what strength looked like, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of stability within feeling. Not the elimination of pain, but the refusal to multiply pain through resistance. His father was dying. That was a fact. Everything else, the meaning, the implications, the emotional interpretation, was optional. 3 weeks later, he sat beside his father's hospital bed, reading aloud from the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. His father's eyes were closed, but his breathing was calm. The morphine helped, but something deeper was at work. A lifetime of quiet dignity was expressing itself in the way he faced this final transition. You learned this before I did, the philosopher said quietly. Didn't you? His father's eyes opened. Still sharp despite everything else failing. Learned what? That nothing external can touch who you really are. His father smiled. Took you long enough to figure it out. They sat in comfortable silence, two men who had both discovered the same secret, that the person who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Because there is nothing left to destroy except the indestructible core of conscious awareness that observes all experience without being diminished by any of it. The weak self dies 1,000 deaths from 1,000 external wounds. The strong self cannot die at all. It is the deathless witness of all that comes and goes. It is what remains when everything else has been stripped away. It is who you really are. Conclusion: the architecture of the unshakable self. The 3 stories, Marcus, Elena, and the philosopher, represent 3 different paths to the same destination, the development of unshakable composure through the systematic destruction of psychological weakness. Each discovered that suffering is not caused by external events, but by the meaning we assign to those events. Each learned that peace comes not from controlling circumstances, but from controlling our response to circumstances. Each found that true strength emerges when we stop seeking it from sources outside ourselves. The weak self is the collection of fears, insecurities, attachments, and dependencies that make us vulnerable to external disruption. It is the part of us that needs others to behave certain ways for us to feel okay. It is the part that measures our worth by external metrics. It is the part that takes other people's problems personally and other people's opinions seriously. This weak self must be identified, examined, and systematically eliminated, not through suppression or denial, but through the kind of clear seeing that dissolves illusions upon contact. The process is neither comfortable nor quick. It requires confronting the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are. It demands that we question every assumption about what we need to be happy, what we deserve from others, and what external changes would solve our internal problems. But the result is freedom from the exhausting work of managing other people's perceptions, controlling uncontrollable outcomes, and maintaining emotional stability through external manipulation. The unshakable person has learned that they are not their circumstances, not their thoughts, not their story. They are the awareness in which circumstances arise and pass away, thoughts come and go, and stories evolve and dissolve. This awareness cannot be threatened because it has nothing to lose. It cannot be diminished because it is not built from anything that can be taken away. It cannot be shaken because it is not standing on ground that others control. It is the bedrock of genuine confidence, authentic power, and lasting peace. It is who you are when everything else has been stripped away. And it has been waiting, patiently and permanently, for you to remember. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable to external forces, but because he becomes transparent to them. Like light passing through clear glass, the opinions, judgments, and actions of others pass through him without obstruction or distortion. He remains himself, regardless of what moves through the space he occupies. This is the deepest teaching of Machiavellian calm. True power is not the ability to control others, but the complete liberation from needing to. When you no longer require external validation, approval, or cooperation to maintain your inner state, you become truly powerful not over others, but over yourself. And that is the only power that can never be taken away.